The Hermitage in St. Petersburg, Russia, is one of the world's greatest museums. On August 1st, 2006, its director made a dramatic announcement. Over 200 items, worth around $5 million, were missing from its store of Russian precious metals and jewelry. All hell broke loose in the press. There were calls for the director to resign. The shockwaves reached the Kremlin, and President Putin himself intervened. The police were quick to make arrests. Their investigation revealed an antiquated system of stock checking and lax security, and they blamed the thefts on museum insiders. But in the complex world of post-communist Russia, plagued by organized crime, corruption, and political intrigue, the truth is never easy to find. Soon, there were suggestions of police brutality and a shocking allegation of murder at the museum.
It's very possible that she was killed as a witness they'd rather do without.
And fears of a darker conspiracy to damage the museum and force regime change at the Hermitage.
There are quite a lot of people in the history of Russia and Soviet Union who have been dreaming of getting somehow into the cellars of Hermitage.
So will the real criminals behind the theft ever be found? Often known as the Venice of the North, the city of St. Petersburg is built on a network of rivers and canals at the point where the river Neva flows out into the Gulf of Finland. It was founded in 1703 by the Russian Tsar Peter the Great as his new capital, and is a city of Baroque palaces, magnificent cathedrals, grand boulevards, and vast squares. At the heart of the city is the Winter Palace, built by the Empress Elizabeth in the mid-18th century as a home for the imperial family. It was the storming of the Winter Palace by the Bolsheviks in October 1917 which ushered in the revolution and 70 years of Soviet rule, an event immortalized with famous inaccuracy by the film director Sergei Eisenstein in his film October. Today, the palace houses what is possibly the greatest museum in the world. It contains the collections of the Tsars and most of the best works of art confiscated from the Russian aristocracy at the time of the revolution.
This museum, Hermitage, an extremely important institution in Russia, very symbolic one. It's not exactly a reflection of Russia, it's always a little bit better than Russia, so if it's bad, it means something is very wrong.
Around 3 million visitors a year flock to view the stunning palace interiors and the unique treasures they contain. Catherine the Great was one of the most important art collectors the world has ever known. She hung her Rembrandts around her billiard room. There are 25 left in the Hermitage today. The first serious patron of the French artist, Matisse, was Russian. His collection was nationalized after the revolution and makes the Hermitage a place of pilgrimage for connoisseurs of Impressionist and Post-Impressionist art. The treasures combine superb metalwork from the ancient world, sacred art from the churches of Europe and Russia, and the jewel-encrusted trappings of the Tsars. But only 5% of the museum's total collection is ever on show in the galleries of the former palace. The other 95%, nearly 3 million items, is tucked away in storage and only emerges, if ever, for special exhibitions. Keeping tabs on this vast hidden collection is the job of the museum's 150 or so curators, organized into 7 specialized departments. This great museum is run by a huge bureaucracy reminiscent of the time of the Tsars. So how could more than 200 items from a single museum department go missing, presumed stolen? The story of the thefts at the Hermitage began with the routine business of checking the storage inventory. It's done on a rotating basis, department by department. In August 2005, it was the turn of the collection of Russian artifacts made from gold, silver, and precious stones. Some come from churches and cathedrals. Others are made for personal adornment or domestic use. The highlights of this collection are on display in the museum's treasuries. When the check was completed, it became apparent there was a major problem. The first to be told was the museum's director. Mikhail Borisovich Petrovsky, a professor of Arab history, is one of Putin's key advisors on culture. He has been director of the Hermitage since 1992, succeeding his father, who died 2 years before.
I was told by head of the Russian department that something is wrong, looks to be missing, so we began to check, and when it was fully checked, we have seen that many objects are missing.
What the inventory revealed was shocking. In total, 221 objects listed in the records couldn't be found in the storerooms. More than half were 19th century icons with silver covers set with jewels. Many of the others were sacred items, silver and enamel chalices and crosses. And there were also a few items of domestic silver. They had disappeared from high-security storage over a period of about 10 years, and the sheer number was staggering.
It was a shock for me, for our colleagues, for Dr. Petrovsky, for everybody. No one in our department or in the Hermitage could expect that something terrible, something like that one could happen.
The museum had to face facts. Over $5 million worth of precious antiques had disappeared right under their noses. The question was, who was responsible?
We began to think about the results, about the events, about the people who worked and who could do it.
There was soon a prime suspect for the thefts, but she was no longer around to be questioned. This is Larissa Zavatsky. She was the curator in charge of most of the missing items and had been leading the audit. She had worked at the Hermitage for 30 years. But 3 months into the checking process, in November 2005, she died at her desk. Apparently, of a heart attack. It was only when a new team of curators took over the inventory check after her death that the thefts were discovered.
Now we are going downstairs from my office to the office Larissa Zavatsky. And now we can see this small room. It's her office, her computer, her chair. Just at that table, just near computer, she died on 8th of November 2005.
Larissa Zavatsky was only 51 years old. She had been in charge of her section for 20 years and had contributed to many books in her field. She left behind a husband and a 25-year-old son, both called Nikolai.
She started working for the Hermitage before I was born. As a person, she was a forceful and serious woman. She loved me and my father very much and cherished us, and she was always very upset when there were any internal conflicts within the family, even when there was nothing in it.
She took part in many exhibition projects. She follow our items to exhibitions inside Russia or abroad.
All the years she worked in our department, she was very beautiful specialist, good specialist. She wrote many articles, she remembered all the items.
Many years really we working together with her, and she was one of curator, and I think that for my mind I not find anything strange.
But despite her good record, the museum authorities decided that so many items could not have disappeared from her collection without her knowledge. But did she take all the items herself? Or had she been blackmailed or bribed into helping others to rob the Hermitage? Larissa's son doesn't accept either story. Instead, he claims she was unaware of any thefts, and shortly before her death, had even spoken herself of finding gaps in the collection.
As far as I know, she discovered that some items were missing. It just seemed that they were nowhere to be found in the store, and I think that she reported it to the management.
If she did report the problem to a superior at the museum, no one has admitted it. But could her own anxiety about the thefts have caused her untimely death? She was known to suffer from poor health.
I only know that she had serious problems with her health, problems with her heart, diabetes. Unfortunately, I don't know any further details.
Sometimes she was ill, heart and so on, so on, so on, so on. And she died really immediately, and it was natural death. Natural death.
After the shock of Larissa Zawadzki's death, a second blow for her colleagues was the possibility that a museum curator could have been stealing from her own collection. Hermitage curators are renowned for taking great pride in the works entrusted to them, treating them almost as their own treasured children.
We could not believe for a long time that she could do it, of course, because we believed her very much.
Still don't believe that she was the only one involved. But well, it was a shock.
Larissa Zawadzki's death may have been a personal tragedy, but the theft from the museum had much wider implications. A public announcement had to be made. In bureaucratic Russia, Dr. Piotrovsky's first priority was to report the thefts to government officials in Moscow before they heard the bad news from anyone else.
The thing was very important to report it in the way so that the officials will know this before the press. Because usually in Russia, in St. Petersburg, if you report something to the police, in 5 minutes, the press knows it even before the head of the police will know the thing.
The Russian president, Vladimir Putin, was the first on his list. Putin grew up in St. Petersburg and has often organized diplomatic events at the museum. Then he put in a call to Mikhail Shvidkoy at the Federal Agency for Culture and Cinematography.
Mr. Petrovsky called me, of course, and this was a short discussions because we discussed about who we will talk with press, and we decided the museum administration must talk with press about this.
On the 1st of August 2006, 9 months after the death of Larissa Zawadzki, and only a few days after the final confirmation of the thefts, Dr. Petrovsky summoned the media at short notice to Catherine the Great's neoclassical theater in the Hermitage.
It's a stab in the back. A stab in the back for the Hermitage, and a stab in the back for the museum community, at a time when we are trying to fight for our autonomy and our rights.
He revealed to journalists that 221 items were missing from the storeroom of Russian precious metals and jewelry, and that the curator responsible had died at her desk 9 months earlier.
It was old tradition in Russia and also in the Hermitage to keep quiet if something happens, something is missing. It was and is still tradition of many museums of the world. I thought that we have to go out with this because if you lie or you cover things, you will make a lot of mistakes afterwards.
The following day, the Hermitage put a complete list of missing items and 21 photographs on its website with an appeal for any information. The public announcement sparked an immediate and surprising response. Just 24 hours later, the St. Petersburg police received an anonymous tip-off. A 19th century icon depicting the assembly of saints had been left in a garbage bin in the city. The head of the police art squad, Vladislav Kirillov, was filmed lifting the icon to safety and showing it off to the Russian television cameras. It was number 97 on the list, its distinctive silver gilt frame studded with precious stones. Who had dumped it, or why, was not revealed. But it didn't stop there. The next day, August 4th, it was the turn of a Moscow gallery, Orthodox Antique. Its owner, Vladimir Studenikin, had studied in an Orthodox seminary and was a passionate collector of Russian sacred art of the kind that featured so heavily on the Hermitage internet list.
I started doing some research to find out whether I had any of these objects in my collection, and I found one of them, a chalice. The description is very similar, and there was a photograph, and I compared it and concluded that it was the chalice that had been stolen from the Hermitage.
Studenikin had bought the silver and enamel-encrusted chalice 2 years earlier, after identifying it as an important and valuable piece.
It was obviously made by a good craftsman, and it was made in a good workshop. It wouldn't have come from a small provincial church. It would have belonged to a large cathedral. So obviously it had a lot of artistic, historical, and cultural value.
He had paid over $13,000 for the chalice, but Studenikin decided to hand it over to the authorities. He chose the Federal Agency for Cultural Security in Moscow, the government body in charge of protecting Russia's cultural heritage.
В Москве мы поддерживаем тесные деловые контакты со многими антикварами, которые...
In Moscow, we maintain close business contacts with many antique dealers who are extremely careful about their names and their reputations, so they prefer to return these valuables through our service. Anyway, at the end of the day, we pass all the evidence to the investigators.
In the days after the museum made its dramatic public announcement of the thefts, the scandal now threatened to overwhelm the Hermitage director. It seemed someone was out to get him. A concerted press campaign demanded his resignation.
As far as my personal resignation is concerned, I read recently in a paper that in all museums around the world, if something untoward happens, the director always resigns. And in the Louvre, the director would have gone. Similar events have occurred in the Louvre, and no director has resigned. As for my resignation, don't hold your breath.
In today's Russia, it's said that press coverage can be bought by the yard. The media campaign was so virulent that Petrovsky was convinced it had been paid for.
The preparedness to have a big response and telling much more about Hermitage and against Hermitage that Hermitage deserved in this situation mean that all this was prepared. The kind of campaign we had in Russian press and electronic press, it's a campaign which costs a lot of money.
Not everyone agrees.
Если бы наши читатели и наши слушатели не проявляли большого
If our readers and our listeners hadn't shown a big interest in the subject, if everybody was totally indifferent to the problems of the museum collections, believe me, the press, the 2, 3, or 5 newspapers, or the 2 TV channels wouldn't have been able to give this story such extensive coverage.
You must understand, this accident was in summertime, when usually in summer, July, August, we have not enough events. Of course, everybody have an enemy. If people in the 50s or the 60s have not enemy, they live the very sad life, you know. Might have a lot of enemy too, it's normal.
But the Hermitage director was now certain his enemies were busy plotting his downfall. In an effort to discover the truth, Petrovsky had already asked his head of security to carry out an inquiry. Alexander Kozainov had been recruited 6 years before from the art and antique squad of the St. Petersburg police. He is proud of his past as an investigator, the medals he won, and his old colleagues on the force. But with the thefts making international news, the investigations by the museum and the St. Petersburg police were soon overtaken by events. The procurator's office in Moscow, the state prosecutor, took charge.
Преступление было очень серьезное и
The crime was so serious and had such resonance, not just in Russia, that it was taken under control of the state prosecutor's office and a special investigation group was set up.
И была создана следственно-оперативная группа. В состав ее входили...
It consisted of officers from the State Investigation Department and from our own antique squad.
The team based themselves in the museum. From the start, they focused on Larissa Zavadsky and her family. Husband Nikolai was a history lecturer who worked in the Sports Institute of St. Petersburg University. His son describes his personality as a stark contrast to his mother's.
No, he's a very gentle person. Gentle and could be easily influenced. Really, he's far too trusting. Maybe as a result of this, it all turned out so badly.
But in Larissa Zavadsky's husband, the authorities had an easy scapegoat.
Ну, я так думаю, что да, правда, он...
I think it's true that he took part in the thefts, but it seems to me that only Larissa Zavadsky could reveal the whole truth about how it was all carried out.
Могла бы рассказать только Лариса Завадская, как это все происходило.
Sometimes her husband visited her here in the Hermitage, of course, and her son too. Sometimes she visited her on Saturdays, maybe on Sundays, I don't know, and on working days too.
Investigators soon had their second target, Nikolai Jr. He now clears imported cars through customs, but for a while, he also worked inside the Hermitage, a position secured for him by his mother.
My mother helped me to get a job at the Hermitage, I think in 1997, in the Department of Scientific Documentation. At that point, I liked it. At that point, I wanted to have a career as a scientific researcher. In the department, there was a minor conflict with the management, and later it emerged that actually it was a conflict between my mother and the management. I was sacked and moved to another department, but a few years later I realized that the place wasn't for me, and putting it mildly, I realized that they didn't want me there and didn't like me very much.
Not surprisingly, perhaps, this period of work at the Hermitage only raised suspicions that he had conspired with his mother to steal from the museum.
I think it's not true that the son did not know about what was going on at the Hermitage, especially given that he worked here as well for some time.
I first learned about the thefts on television. I vaguely heard some TV report that there was some sort of scandal at the Hermitage and that some objects had been stolen. My father and I didn't have a chance to discuss it properly. We wanted to talk to the investigators to tell them what we knew, and somehow help them in every way to find some clues for the crime.
The Zavadkis would get their chance to talk to the investigators sooner than they expected. The family's home is in an apartment building in the north of Old St. Petersburg. In a dawn raid on the 5th of August 2006, police arrived to arrest both father and son.
In the best KGB traditions, in the early morning, the police arrived and took us to their antiques department, and after that, I found myself in prison.
The cells for prisoners under interrogation, but not yet charged, are in the former headquarters of the KGB, known as the Big House. On the nearby river embankment sit the sculptures of two sphinxes, designed by the sculptor Shemyakin in 1995, located over the drain where, in the Soviet era, the blood of tortured prisoners flowed out into the river.
In fact, there were just two questions. Where are the stolen items? And where is the money? I told them I don't know.
The police now had their prime suspects in custody. But there would soon be further arrests and, as the story unfolded, evidence that other, darker forces may have been at work. Yet more investigations began. Two agencies from the Ministry of Culture in Moscow dispatched teams to the museum to figure out why the inventory and security system had failed. They soon uncovered further mistakes in the way the museum staff had logged their collections. More had been stolen than they first thought.
Our staff confirmed the absence of a correct checking procedure in this department and the absence of these particular objects. Furthermore, they subsequently found that there were a further 6 objects missing from this collection.
So was there a fatal flaw in the way the Hermitage collection was stored and protected? In an age of sophisticated technology, the system of keeping track of items at the museum was more like something from the age of the Tsars. Even now, the Hermitage staff are still reluctant to swap their dusty old books for computers.
It's a question for discussion, because you can write by your hand and everybody knows that it's your hand.
Computer inventory, it's a toy, it's a gimmick, but it's not a real inventory. Real inventory must be on paper.
This is one of the inventory books of our museum. There are the numbers of every item in our museum, the description and the sizes, for example, technique, condition. I believe more this old system. It's my own opinion.
Also under scrutiny were security arrangements for the storerooms. Access to Larissa Zavadsky's store of Russian precious metals is through 2 nondescript doors in the walls of one of the museum's public galleries.
We are just near the first door to the storage where Larissa worked, and to enter it is possible only for the curators. All the doors are closed, keys, the special electronic system, and the personal seal of the curator.
The doors to Larissa's storage remain barred while the investigation continues. But for any curator to gain access to their collection, they must follow a standard security procedure.
The procedure is, at the pass control office, they get their keys and nowadays an access control card, and then they proceed to their place of work. There they switch off the security alarm.
Curators can then unlock the doors to their storages, mainly located in the hidden corridors and rooms formerly used by the palace servants.
They sign in the book, and according to the rules, the curator is never alone in the storeroom.
The European porcelain storage is organized along the same lines as Larissa's would have been. Cupboards installed before the revolution are secured using a thin strip of wire and an imprint from the curator's individual seal. So how could Larissa Zavadsky have stolen and stolen again, removing pieces from the museum stores without being challenged? The commissions from Moscow examined security procedures at the staff exit, a set of doors to the rear of the building, on the banks of the river Neva. Could Larissa Zavadsky simply had carried out the items one by one, hidden in her bag? The metal detector was only installed 3 years ago. Perhaps Larissa managed to evade it.
Nobody never opened their bags from the permanent staff of Hermitage when they come in and come out from Hermitage. Never. Mrs. Zawadskaya was well known for people from security service, and nobody never can image this. They must look in a back or make some security procedure for her.
Well, curators have certain privileges, and nobody can search people coming out of the museum according to the law. Only policemen can search a person, and only in special situations. So if you work in the museum, you can always find a lot of ways how you can take it, because museum is based on trust.
Had Larissa Zawadzki betrayed that trust? Her husband and son were now being held by the police for questioning. But the day after they were taken in for interrogation, investigators made a third arrest. They were following a completely different line of inquiry. They had begun to trace back the ownership of items that had been returned. The silver and enamel chalice handed over by Moscow gallery owner Vladimir Studenikin had been bought in 2004 from a Maxim Shepul, a St. Petersburg collector and art dealer.
С Максимом я знаком несколько лет.
I have known Maxim for a few years, and I know only positive things about him.
Как хорошего человека, как коллекционера с хорошей репутацией.
I know him as a good person, as a collector who has a good reputation, and I couldn't imagine that he would be mixed up in this scandal.
В этой скандальной истории, когда он предложил этот предмет.
When he offered to sell me this object, I was sure that it couldn't be stolen. And I think that Maxim himself would not have bought this object either and got mixed up in the story.
Shepul was arrested on August 6th and questioned by investigators. He told them he'd bought the chalice in a St. Petersburg junk shop. But bizarrely, 3 days later, he was transferred to the psychiatric ward of the police hospital. The police claimed he had driven a pen 3.5 centimeters into his own eye. Was this possible? His wife thought not.
Officially, it was self-harm due to psychiatric disorder. I don't believe it because my husband has a phobia about pain. On top of this, I'm 1,000% confident that he would never harm himself.
So did investigators inflict the injury in their haste to secure a quick conviction in such a high-profile case? If so, the tactic didn't work. A week later, he was released through lack of evidence and still hasn't spoken publicly of his experiences.
I feel guilty about Maxim because I had to reveal where I bought my object to help the investigation. And so the situation is unfortunately the way it is now.
But if the arrest of Shepul had drawn a blank, police soon announced a dramatic breakthrough in the case. They claimed Nikolai Zawadzki Sr. had confessed to selling more than 50 items stolen from his wife's collection at the Hermitage. The damning evidence had apparently come from one of the city's pawn shops. In Russia, pawn shops are known as Lombards, reflecting their origin in the Italian region of Lombardy. They offer the traditional pawn shop service, paying in advance on a valuable item which can later be reclaimed. But they also buy and sell antiques and jewels in the normal way. It emerged that a Lombard located at number 13 Lenin Street had supplied police with receipts for around 50 items they claimed to have bought from the Zawadzkis. All had apparently appeared on the Hermitage list of missing items, but were no longer in the hands of the pawn shop owner. He refused to be interviewed for this program, but conveniently, his evidence seemed to be all the police needed to sew up the case against Zawadzki. The following day, on August 10th, police arrived at St. Petersburg's Moscow station after another cloak and dagger tip-off. Inside one of the luggage lockers, they discovered a plastic bag containing 2 small paintings and an 18th century silver gilt crucifix. The next day, the owner of a second pawn shop came forward in person with a silver gilt cross he had seen on the list of missing items. He also had further damning evidence of the Zawadzkis' involvement.
В августе 2005 года Лариса Завадская приходила в наш магазин несколько раз.
In August 2005, Larissa Zawadzki came to our store several times. She brought some quite attractive items which she wanted to sell. She told us a very dramatic story about some friends of hers who'd been in a car accident and were in the hospital, and they needed to sell their possessions to raise money to pay for their treatment.
Придя во второй раз, она принесла...
The second time she came, she brought a silver gilt cross, dating from the middle of the 18th century. We managed to agree a price, and we bought it.
Alexander Prokhorov identified Larissa as the main negotiator, but also implicated her husband, Nikolai, in the sale.
В первом случае он ее просто ждал.
The first time, he was just waiting for her in the car outside. We didn't see him. The second time, he was walking around the shop, looking at various things, and only when we came to an agreement and decided to buy the cross, she told us she didn't have any ID with her and asked her husband to show us his documents and be listed as the seller.
Nikolai Zavadsky signed a receipt for the sale, and the couple left with 20,000 rubles, around $800, less than a tenth of the price Prokhorov believes he could have sold it for. Almost exactly a year later, Prokhorov saw reports of the Hermitage thefts. He retrieved the cross from the shop's safe. But after what happened to Maxim Shepul, he felt he needed impartial witnesses present when he took it to the police.
Мы позвонили на радио «Эхо Москвы».
We called the radio station Moscow Echo, and the journalist came here. Then they called the police and negotiated a meeting for the next day. The journalists were prepared to be mediators or just observers to make sure the whole procedure was absolutely legal and that our rights were not compromised in any way.
On the same day as Prokhorov's deliberately public handover, police made a fourth arrest. Ivan Sabalev, an historian who had worked with Nikolai Zavadsky Sr. at the Institute of Physical Culture and Sport in the 1990s. Zavadsky had apparently told police that Sabalev had encouraged them to begin stealing from the Hermitage. He had even sold 2 icons for them in 1994. Investigators wanted to see if he too could be implicated in the sale of so many Hermitage treasures. On the 17th of August, 3 more items were left at the headquarters of the art squad. A silver gilt crucifix dated 1731, an icon of St. Nicholas with a silver cover, and a fake Fabergé dog given to the Hermitage by the courts after the prosecution of a famous forger. The Hermitage staged an exhibition after 31 pieces had been returned, most as a result of anonymous tip-offs. Just as it seemed that the prosecution case was complete, there was a surprising new twist. On the 23rd of August, Nikolai Zavadsky Jr. was released from prison without charge. He maintains his innocence and is convinced that his father confessed to thefts he had made in a deal to secure his son's release.
In my opinion, my father made his confessions under pressure from the investigators, because, as I realized, I was arrested as a hostage so that my father would take the blame for the whole crime and all the thefts. And when my father signed everything the police wanted, they let me out.
For Nikolai Jr., the crucial evidence supplied by the 2 pawn shops was flawed.
Отец носил в ломбард какие-то вещи, но это были исключительно вещи нашей семьи.
Yes, my father did in fact take some things to pawn shops, but these were things which belonged to our family, his parents. We had some antiques at home, but they belonged exclusively to our family and had nothing to do with the Hermitage.
He has particular doubts about the origins of the 50 incriminating receipts from the Lenin Street Lombard.
50 receipts from one pawn shop? I think what, they faked them? As far as I know, and from what my lawyer told me, and my father's lawyer told me at the time, even the handwriting on the receipts didn't look like my father's. The receipts were filled out in a different hand.
Alexander Prokhorov was also surprised that his Lenin Street competitors hadn't blown the whistle earlier.
If
I was in a situation where the same person again and again brought some precious objects to the shop, I would definitely become suspicious. It wouldn't seem normal to me. Not normal these days.
Nikolai Zavadsky believes that his father did a deal with the police. If he confessed to stealing a large proportion of items and went along with the story of selling it all to pawn shops, his son would be released. So had Nikolai Sr. made a false confession? The fourth man arrested in connection with the thefts certainly thought so. Ivan Sobolev had been seized after Nikolai Sr. identified him as the initiator of the thefts. He had sold 2 icons for the Zavodskis in 1994. Under Russian law, defendants cannot be prosecuted for a crime committed more than 10 years earlier, so Sobolev was released without charge, but only after 3 months in prison. Immediately after his release, he talked to the St. Petersburg weekly newspaper, Vash Tayny Sovietnik, your mystery advisor. He described the pressure the investigators were putting on Zavadsky to implicate his former colleague in the thefts.
At a meeting on the 15th of August, he denied virtually everything he had said and written about me earlier. As far as I understand, he was then visited by the chief investigator in his solitary confinement. I don't know what they talked about, but afterwards, Zavadsky's memory came back.
According to Sobolev, Zavadsky was persuaded to perjure himself in exchange for seeing his son walk free.
It was a matter of determining the fate of Nikolai Zavadsky's 25-year-old son, who had also been charged in connection with the thefts. And this was the only thing that Nikolai cared about. He would have signed anything you dictated to him.
After Sobolev's release, Nikolai Zavadsky Sr. remained the only suspect identified and prosecuted by investigators. His trial in a St. Petersburg district court began on the 21st of January, 2007. Nikolai Jr. also appeared as a witness. His father now admitted selling 77 items from the Hermitage. He insisted he and his wife had done so to pay for the insulin she needed to treat her diabetes. But was this just part of a cover story cooked up for him by police? Many in the museum were still skeptical about the official version of events. Why, for starters, did the Zavodskis sell through pawn shops? Most of the 31 returned items could be traced back to Lombards in the city. But as Alexander Prokhorov revealed, they wouldn't have gotten anywhere near the full market value. So why not sell to specialist antique dealers instead?
The story of pawn shops and the amount of money which she received is really strange because, well, she knew all the big antique dealers and she knew the right prices of the things. Also, these receipts from the pawn shops show very small amounts of money, which is another mystery.
Even if the couple hadn't gotten the full value, estimated at around $5 million in total, they would still have walked away with a significant amount of money. But a tour of the family apartment only adds to the mystery. there is absolutely no sign of affluence.
Here's the kitchen. There are 2 fridges. This is our fridge and washing machine. This is our neighbor's fridge and washing machine. That's our table.
It is a communal apartment. The bathroom and kitchen are shared with another family. The Zawadzkis had 2 rooms to themselves, a bedroom.
This is where my wife and I live, but it used to be my parents' room.
And a sitting room.
Here's the room where my father lives now and where we used to live some time ago. Here are our books. Not all of them, though. I didn't see at all that my parents had any more money than usual, and there was no golden stream turning towards us. Of course, we weren't really poor, we didn't beg, but we weren't living in luxury.
The Zawadzkis' lifestyle clashes with the idea that they were criminal masterminds pulling off a multi-million-dollar heist. Their museum colleagues have concluded that they couldn't have acted alone. Could Larissa and her husband have been bribed or blackmailed by a third party, the real architect of the crime? If so, who was it, and how did they hope to gain from the thefts? A number of theories have emerged. Top of the list in many minds were the criminal gangs that have flourished in post-Soviet Russia.
After the well-known events in Russia, we had a dramatic growth in crime. There were lots of criminal groups, and they tried to carve up everything they could lay their hands on, including things they shouldn't have. Some of these groups were also involved in the theft of antiques.
I think that maybe happened that she was used as an instrument, and she was used that maybe any aggression from criminal, of course it may be. I think that we are not free from the world, of course, yes. But I not believe that she may be a leader, as a criminal leader, I not believe.
Larissa Zawadzki's death at work also came under the spotlight. As she had diabetes and heart problems, at the time it was assumed she had died of natural causes. But had she? There were some who began to suspect that she might have been murdered to cover up the identity of the real criminals.
I can't be sure, but it's very possible that she was killed as a witness they'd rather do without.
Certainly some of the television channels propose that maybe somebody helped her to die. I don't think so, because if there was a conspiracy, in a certain way, her death somehow stopped everything.
Petrovsky felt the answer might lie elsewhere. From an early stage, he had believed that shadowy forces within the Russian establishment were behind the thefts. Initially, it had been the speed and pure theater of the returns of some of the stolen items that rang warning bells for the Hermitage director.
So I knew that, well, some objects will come back, but I never expected they'll come back so quickly in such a strange way. Also, from what I know now, quite a lot of antique dealers knew that the things do come from Hermitage.
But if antique dealers had discovered that the Hermitage was being systematically robbed, why had they kept quiet? Petrovsky suspects someone was plotting to blow the whistle, expose the thefts, and create a massive scandal for the museum.
I think that we managed to announce this approximately 1 month or 2 months before it was planned to be announced by other people.
He was also troubled by another key question. How could one of his own trusted curators have had the steely nerves required to walk time and again past the guards, knowing she had Hermitage treasures in her bag? Perhaps she felt she had the protection or approval of someone in authority.
I can't understand how she managed to take out all these 200 pieces. Any moment you can be stopped and asked, so it's also very difficult psychologically until you have some guarantee from somebody that it will go well.
For Petrovsky, All the evidence was pointing once again towards Larissa being a pawn in a much larger conspiracy.
I think that maybe Larissa began to steal, but somehow somebody understood and knew that she was stealing and selling. Maybe somebody persuaded her to feel secure or to go on and to make a real theft of big things which must be discovered rather soon. You know, you can't think that it will never be discovered. So I think that somebody persuaded her to take these things out of the museum, to use it to some other purposes, not just stealing and selling.
If the thefts were ordered, was someone hoping to exploit the ensuing scandal to topple the museum director? Petrovsky certainly felt a vicious press campaign against him had been carefully planned and paid for. But who would want him out, and why?
There are quite a lot of people in the history of Russia and Soviet Union who have been dreaming of getting somehow into the cellars of Hermitage and other museums, into the storages of the museums, somehow to put their hand of them for different purposes.
The museum director is reluctant to be drawn into who these shadowy conspirators could be. But speculation has ranged from senior museum staff to local politicians and even to government officials in Moscow. If Petrovsky was ousted and replaced by a corrupt director, perhaps the floodgates would open on a wholesale plunder of Hermitage treasures.
You know, this rumor about the corruptions in the Russian government, Russian cultural institution, for me is much more rumor.
Mikhail Shvidkoy is no stranger to accusations of corruption himself. In 2005, the present Minister of Culture criticized the corruption rampant in his ministry in the time of his predecessor. His predecessor was Mikhail Shvidkoy.
This was a quite big scandal because my lawyers opened the criminal case against the Ministry of Culture. In the results of these investigations, the Minister of Culture must said that he was mistake.
Shvidkoy survived his scandal. Now he was the man with the right to sack the Hermitage director over the thefts. Would he allow Petrovsky to come through unscathed?
Of course, this was a very strong shock for Mr. Petrovsky and for his reputation too. Mr. Petrovsky is high-quality professional. This was my idea and my proposal. He must keep his position because this kind of cases maybe exist everywhere and any times.
Petrovsky survived the campaign to force him out of office, but his museum and its curators are now under close scrutiny. In the wake of the thefts, President Putin created a commission to investigate storage and security in all of the nation's museums. The teams sent to the Hermitage are already warning that other curators might face investigation by the police.
You and I know that it's not only the XVID collection that suffered from the thefts, but the collections of other Hermitage curators. And all these circumstances will be revealed as a result of further investigations by the police.
In an effort to protect the Hermitage from similar thefts in the future, the government has now agreed to speed up funding to extend a modern storage facility, opened 3 years ago, on the outskirts of St. Petersburg. On the 15th of March 2007, Nikolai Zavadsky Sr. was sentenced to 5 years in prison and ordered to pay damages of around $300,000. The case appeared to be over, but the police investigation has raised as many questions as it has answered. Was Zavadsky pressured into a confession, as his son still maintains? Why was Nikolai Jr. released if police felt he was also involved? How did Maxim Shepel receive the horrific injury to his eye while in custody? Did the Zawadzkis mastermind the thefts themselves, or did they fall victim to corrupt forces beyond their control? Petrovsky continues to believe that the scandal was manufactured to damage his reputation and the museum. Meanwhile, 195 out of the 226 stolen items are still missing. Will they ever be found?